Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Whole Elephant. So glad that you're here on this journey with us, trying to look outside of our perspectives, outside of our comfort zones, outside of the stuff we grew up with. And today we're doing that in a much more familiar way, I suppose. The name probably sounded familiar when you clicked on the episode that said Mike McClenahan. Mike McClenahan is my uncle. And after 40 plus years of ministry in a church, he just announced recently that he's getting ready to retire sometime before the end of this year. So I thought it would be cool to sit down with him and say, man, a lifetime of ministry. What did you learn? What changed? What stayed the same? And what are you hopeful for or worried about with the church moving forward? I love my Uncle Mike, and this was so fun to be able to do this podcast with him. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the chat. Uncle Mike.
Hey, Eric.
Here we are. Good to have you, man.
Thanks.
This has been a long time coming. I actually was looking through my notes on my phone for this podcast, and season 1, I had your name written down to reach out to you.
Yeah.
And we just didn't get to it, and then COVID happened, and then all these things. And I was like, you know what? Now's the time. And now's a great time. So thank you for being here.
Yep. You're welcome.
Let's just start off. After how many years of ministry?
Mm-hmm.
You're retiring.
Yeah. Formally, I was ordained in April Fool's 1990.
My first day here at Montrose Church was April Fool's.
See?
And I think it's Dave playing the longest April Fool's joke on our congregation of all time.
I love it. That year I turned 30 on the 3rd, and I was ordained on the 1st. So nice. That's formally, in terms of ordained ministry, 34 years. But I've been working at a church. Another way of thinking about it is have not had to choose a church to worship at since I was 24 years old.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're a lot like
40 years.
My boss. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've only been, 2 places, technically.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so it's been a long run. So I'm retiring sometime this year.
But I mean, I know you. You're my uncle. You're not like retiring. Like you're not going to like all of a sudden have a workshop in your garage and go out and have breakfast and then tinker in the garage and then take a nap. That's not going to be what do you have lined up moving forward?
Well, Amy and I have been talking since September of 2020, when COVID hit and we were all taken out of our normal routines.
And we all wanted to retire.
And I realized I turned 60. And I've got a runway here till I turn 65, kind of a normal runway. Yeah. And that September, our 4th grandson, Kit, was 6 months old. Mm-hmm. And Hannah, our 3rd granddaughter, was just born.
Yeah.
And so we thought, in COVID, we went from being grandparents of 5 to 7. Mm-hmm. And how are we going to be involved in their lives?
Yeah.
Also thinking about, I think COVID was a great time to think in a time of desolation where we are like without the things that give us great joy that we're used to, the people, the routines. Just had a chance for us to say, okay, if we were retired right now, what would we choose to do? If we were all done with ministry, what would we do? So Amy and I started keeping a journal together of dreams, of what it would look like and where would we move. And so we've tried to create some priorities of what's the best scenario for Mike and Amy as a couple.
Yeah.
What's the best scenario for Mike and Amy with their family, including yourself and your family, my brother, Connor, and Sherry Ann and the 4 boys, for us to be able to visit Brendan and Rachel and the girls without worrying about getting home for a worship service.
Yeah.
It just seems like all of our visits are squeezed around working on Sundays.
I know.
And so what if we just removed that? So I feel like we have a lot of energy to do things. There are things that we want to use our gifts. We want to figure out what's our new community, not having chosen a community for 40 years. And we've been together 39 of those 40 years.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? And so it'll be an opportunity for us to use our gifts in other ways.
Yeah.
I definitely want to remain connected to church ministries and pastors and use my gifts to encourage people to be faithful in their ministries.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I think if I quit ministry right now, the number one thing I would enjoy is having weekends and holidays back.
Yeah.
I don't know if like people realize how brutal like Christmas Eve,
Mm-hmm.
Easter, how brutal those days are on families,
Mm-hmm.
and that wears on you
Mm-hmm.
year after year. COVID time, I coped in a certain way, but I'm also like I'm a hibernator. I'm not a outgoing person. I'm like an introvert performer. I feel very comfortable in front of 1,000 people. I feel very uncomfortable in a one-on-one conversation. That's not a podcast. You are a people person.
Yeah.
I remember being really young and going to Disneyland with you and my family. And I remember looking at my mom and going, why does Uncle Mike talk to everybody in line?
Uh-huh.
If he notices it's someone's birthday, all of a sudden he's leading the entire line in happy birthday. He has to meet everybody. He's giving high fives. How did you cope during that time?
Yeah, during COVID.
Yeah.
It was hard. And COVID was especially hard because we had just made some changes in the way we worshiped so that I felt really great about our unified worship service. We no longer had contemporary or traditional.
Yeah.
We had a contemporary band-led service with the choir singing with the band, which was a huge, huge shift culturally for us. And we were about 3 or 4 years in, and then COVID hit, and none of that joy. And there are trade-offs for things like Easter and working Sundays. There's a really nice thing about being involved in people's lives for me, and to see them and to see the connections. Like I look at a room of people and I think this person ought to know this person.
Yeah.
And usually like Dottie, who's 95, needs to know Nicole, who's 35, because they're both women in our church and they don't know each other and they worship 10 feet apart.
Right.
So I'm going to try to broker that, and that gives me joy. Or somebody sharing with me personally something they would never send an email to me about. I get to just see those interactions. That gives me great joy.
Yeah.
And I love being there on a Christmas Eve when you see all these families coming together, and I know there's all these dynamics at play, and somehow we are offering something really meaningful for this family to connect on Christmas Eve.
Right.
So anyway, you take all that away during COVID, and it was really hard. I was angry. I was definitely was a place of desolation for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And hard to find the consolation in the midst of it.
Yeah.
That went every level of my work. It went from the staff relationships that I enjoyed, and I'm a collaborative leader.
Yeah.
So I do the same thing in our hallway. I'm like, I pop into so-and-so's office. Hey, I'm thinking about this. What do you think? And all that interaction, to me, I lived off that.
Totally.
And now I'm sitting at home thinking, should I call this person? No,
Yeah.
they're probably busy.
Yeah, totally.
And then we're preaching to a camera.
Yeah.
And I realized that my 30-minute message is 20 minutes because I'm not waiting to see people's response.
Yeah, for sure.
There's no dialogue. And it's Amy pushing the play button on my iPhone and then going, well, how did it go?
Yeah.
I think that was pretty good. I don't know.
Yeah.
So to go at least a year without feedback, and without that, having the joy of being with the people that you have been called to gather into this community, that was hard, really hard.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, we don't get a lot of feedback in general on a Sunday unless it's negative, right? Not a lot of people like really take the time to say how great it is. During COVID, even less. People are probably watching it while they're also on their phones or cooking breakfast or something. There was one Sunday where I felt we were live streaming from the sanctuary. The band would come in distance and we'd play, and live streaming from there. I felt so alone that I said, when 2 or more are gathered, even online. So put the number 2 if you're watching right now. And that was the one Sunday that it was like people just started doing 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, and you're like, oh, okay, we're all here.
We're
here, and they're listening and they're engaged.
Yeah,
but that was really tough. There was an aspect of it, and I don't want to downplay how hard COVID was. It was hard for everyone for sure, but from a creative standpoint, I enjoyed it because Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday in the same room with the same people, it was a creative challenge to try to figure out how to do it. And I think I made some of my best art during that time, just because I was forced to be creative. But COVID's boring. Let's not talk about that anymore.
Well, I mean, there are things that we've taken away, and we said, okay, we've learned how to do things differently. Now we can have a committee meeting on Zoom.
Yes.
And people don't have to drive 45 minutes.
And more people show up to a board meeting if it's on Zoom than if it's in person.
And I can
up.
connect with people across the country instead of just having a phone call. We can have a face-to-face conversation in our offices.
1,000%.
Which is awesome. That's cool.
It normalized doing podcasts on Zoom. It normalized doing all those things. It's great.
I think the other part of this was the interpersonal relationships that we have with people, where we're not honest about the fact that the real reason they're angry right now is because all of their life has been taken away from them.
Yeah.
Instead of they're angry because we weren't responding to COVID right. And I think it pushed me even farther into this cynicism about the church. Like, what are we really here for? What does it mean for us to commit to one another?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be an elder or a deacon or a long-term member when you leave because there wasn't enough energy the Sunday you came back?
Yeah.
One of the first times we met, we weren't quite sure what to do. Or you left our church because we were wearing masks.
1,000%.
And I think
we stayed closed 2 weeks longer than you would have liked.
Right. I'm so sorry. And so now you're gone after 35 years.
Yeah, 1,000%.
So that just was like, what in the heck is going on here?
No, totally.
And that added to my cynicism of, well, it erodes my hopefulness and optimism about the church being a family that actually sticks together.
1,000%.
So it tapped into my own anger and grief.
Yeah.
That I had to pay attention to.
We definitely had those situations happen. And even still, when the political climate gets crazy and you see people in your church posting stuff on Facebook and stuff like that, you just, like, what are we doing? Like, how do you go to our church every Sunday and then go home and post that? You know what I mean? Yeah. And what you start to realize is, like, we really have their attention for like an hour, and everything else, Fox News, CNN, both sides of the aisle, everything has their attention the rest of the week. And
the soccer field does. The lacrosse team does.
Exactly.
It has way more. So how do we understand discipleship as more than a once a week event? It has to be.
It has to be.
And that was part of the journey that we were on that started before COVID, that I think has helped us and helped me get ready for retirement. Was in 2019, we started asking the question, are we actually making disciples? And how would we know if we were?
Yeah.
And so we engaged with a company that does assessments called Reveal for church. It originally came out of Willow Creek, and they were asking the same question. We know that we are measuring discipleship by people's activity level, but is anything really changing inside of them? Are they growing in their love for God? Are they growing in their love for others?
Right.
And how do we measure that? So they did the Reveal study, and they asked people what they actually do and then how their behavior looks. So we took it in 2019, and this was going to be the way we were going to measure our success as a church.
Right.
And what we got back was really sad news that we were at the bottom of their archetypes in a troubled church because we had exchanged intimacy with God for activity for God, which is what a lot of churches do. Well, hey, we have this many people who are involved in this activity. We have this many people coming to worship. We have this many people who are giving. We have this many people who are volunteering. I'm like, yeah, but what's happening? Like, do they know God any better? So we have people who have been in our church 35 years or longer. We have an older congregation. So what it comes down to is they're stuck in a stage of faith development that relies solely on what the church does for them or tells them to do.
Right.
And once they once they've gone through the whole program, they get to a wall. When they get to that wall, what they have to do is figure their faith out for themselves. They have to okay, well, what's my relationship with God? What goes on in between all of these programs I'm involved in?
Right.
And if they don't break through that wall, they usually go to another church.
Right.
Because that new church has a new set of expectations that seems exciting, and I'm learning things I've never heard before. Like that's great, but they still never get to it. So it's like stage 2 Christians, which means that you stay in teenage world. And you never break into adulthood where you take responsibility. So we did that in 2019. And the one prescription from the consultant felt like we were doing youth ministry all over again. People need to be spending 15 minutes with God in their favorite chair every day. Well, and doing what? Reflecting on Scripture, praying prayers of gratitude and confession.
Yeah.
And that's it. So we did this whole campaign, 15 minutes alone in our favorite chair with God. And we provided some reading plans and things. And then COVID hit. And now people have more than 15 minutes in their favorite chair every day. And they knew what to do.
Right.
When the news came to our church, there was this great sense of conviction, like, yes, this is what we need.
Right.
And then they all did it. We had the support of the whole church. And we just kept talking about 15 minutes alone with God. 15. So then in 2021, we took the survey again. And we went from a troubled church to a vitalized church.
Yeah.
And that this axis, the vertical axis, has everything to do with people's personal spiritual practices.
Right.
Which is what we often miss when we just do church and people come to things. So now they're owning their faith. And then we took it again in 2023 because we thought, well, maybe that was just a COVID bump. Everybody was at home. Of course, they're spending time with God. No, in 23, then we stayed as high on that axis and we moved over to the right, which was the church helping people on their spiritual pathway. Yeah. So we ended up through COVID from 2019 to 2023, actually being more spiritually vital church because we've been on this journey together. Yeah. So now they say to us, hey, look, at this place, you have spiritual capital with your congregation. Right. They trust you and they're growing in their faith. What can you do to draw on the spiritual capital of your church? Yeah. And I thought, like a building campaign or a new mission project. I thought, or what about my retirement? Because it's going to take some withdrawals from the bank of trust. Totally. So I started planning my retirement in 2023.
Yeah. There's such a fine balance between wanting to do that spiritual growth stuff, but then also you have to present as professional and put together, and the sound has to be good, the band has to be good, the live stream video has to be good, the live stream sound has to be good, and all of a sudden, like, all the facade things, all the production things can easily take up my whole week. And then I get up and sing for 30 minutes, which is like the main part of what I'm supposed to be doing. Has that changed over your course of ministry, where it's harder to find a balance, or 20 years ago, was it the same, trying to balance those things?
You mean in ministry between production?
The production of what's happening and the underlying faith growth experience.
I think the language has always been there. I think there's always been things that keep us busy, that keep us, like in the 90s, everybody was worried about how are we being seeker sensitive, and so we did everything to try to create new spaces, new classrooms. We didn't use technology, but we were trying to figure out what's the new thing that's going to grab people's attention. Right. And I think the same thing can be true. It can be a distraction from what really helps people to grow spiritually. Yeah. And the distraction itself, if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, it looks great, and we look great. We look like a church that had it together. Yeah. And we could have kept doing it. And a lot of churches look like that. Yeah. Long-term members who are doing the things they're supposed to do. And then you say, well, where are the new young people? How come we don't have young people here? Yeah. And then you try to go for a technical fix that will get the young people here. Totally. Instead of saying, no, what we have in our church is people of all different ages who are growing in their love for God and their love for others. Yeah. And if they are, they're going to be the ones who are going to be welcoming people into this life of discipleship. Yeah. It's more organic. Yeah. If we keep creating whatever that new thing is, even the new technology or the new program to attract people, then we're not relying on the people themselves to be the attraction. Right. Like you walk into a room and you go, immediately whether you feel welcomed or not. Somebody reaches a hand out before the pastor ever says anything. Right. And we think it's all about that really cool thing. Oh, we have screens now. Yeah, but if you had screens and you had whatever, but without love, it's nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of feel like Christian culture from a marketing standpoint, from a CCM, what worship music now is, it sets a false expectation for what it's supposed to look like on a Sunday. And small churches like mine cannot match what Brandon Lake is doing in a worship thing with 75 choir members and lights and fog that they go watch on YouTube. And then they expect to have that experience on Sunday. We can't possibly match that. You know what I mean? And if we try, we will fail. So the only way that we can keep people around, the only way we could do it authentically is to create relationships. And I think instead of trying to give them a show, give them a job that they're passionate about, connecting them.
Totally. No, I think as I'm preparing for retirement, the theme I keep hitting and the message series I'm just wrapping up in 1 Corinthians 12 is, you are the body of Christ.
Yeah.
And you are all gifted. Know your spiritual gifts and use them. Yeah. And if we as pastors, and we've been talking about this since I was an intern in the 80s. This was a big deal at Glendale Presbyterian Church, was equipping people for their ministry. And I think we've turned into, with all this stuff, we've turned not into the church with its members who know their gifts, who are all working together and building up the body in love to bear witness to Christ. We've become more of a consumer culture to say, I really like that music, I really like that podcast, I really like that preacher.
Totally.
And they realize I'm not even, and we've set up church, if it's dark, if you can't even see the people around you, if nobody's asking you to serve, then you don't have this experience of belonging, that I'm actually contributing something here.
Yeah.
And I think that's a superficial way of seeing the church. So I really want people to know in my retirement, no, you can do this because the Spirit of God is in you and has gifted you to be the body.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to get us past the divisions of politics or whatever, culture, language.
Right.
It's going to be because we realize that we are the body of Christ. And we've been called to this body of Christ to build each other up and to demonstrate the kingdom to our neighbors.
Taking me back to young Mike McClenahan, just starting out in ministry, and what your expectations were, what you thought it was going to be, how you thought it worked, and then fast forward to now, what has anything changed over that time? Were things not the way you thought they would be? Were things exactly the way you thought they would be? What has happened over those years of ministry?
I think, like anybody in their 20s, you're idealistic about whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah.
And young life was a really important part of my growing up. And the church was a really important part of my growing up. And I think God gave me a vision of what church could be like to combine those two things.
Right.
And I thought it was going to be, it was fun. It was really fun to do ministry. And in those years, we did some really fun things as you were growing up and working with my friends and the connections that we all had growing up together and young life and the different churches, the things we were able to do were so fun. And when we moved to Northern California and our boys were 2.5, and we abandoned all of you here, you enter into a church where you don't have friends, and now you don't have family, and now friends have to become family, and how do you navigate that? That's a challenging thing in ministry, to figure out who your friends are.
Yeah.
Who do you spend Christmas Eve with?
Right.
Who do you go for Easter brunch? Who do you celebrate a birthday with? So I think
who's safe to be real with?
Who's safe? Who can handle hanging out with a pastor on Christmas Eve?
Yeah. And
we get treated like human beings.
Yeah. So
those were challenging. I'd say that to this day continues to be a challenge. Not to be friendly, because Uncle Mike likes to talk to everybody in line.
For sure.
And I can be friendly with everybody, but who can we be safe with as a family? That's important for us.
Yeah.
I think moving from an intern to a director to an associate pastor, you're shielded from all of the stuff that a senior pastor has to deal with that I didn't fully appreciate.
Yeah.
And what I realized is that as a pastor, somebody just said this to me recently, that you are the object of somebody's projection. You are either at times the hero or the villain, or both at the same time.
Yeah.
And I don't think I was prepared as a senior pastor to hit both of those things.
Right.
What I was doing, to some, I was the hero. Wow, this is amazing. I can't believe what you're doing with our church.
Right.
This is so great. Look, young people are coming, and look, we got new members, and oh my gosh, I love my small group. We never would have done this without you, Mike. That's great. Right. And other people saying, how could you take my service away from me?
Yeah.
And you get a 2-page long email.
Yeah.
That I just think, who would you send this to?
Yeah.
Really? Your pastor gets this email?
Yeah.
And I just don't think, which of course taps into my own then experience of family growing up, of grief, loss, conflict. And it's not that I'm conflict avoidant. It's just, I don't know how to resolve this thing because I'm a pastor. This person is not. They see me as having to provide something for them that I can't provide for them.
Yeah.
And so how do we come together as peers?
Right.
And have reconciliation? It's just a weird.
Yeah.
It's just a weird thing.
There is a weird thing in church where I don't tell my auto mechanic how to fix my car. I wouldn't tell my surgeon how to perform surgery on my heart.
Yeah.
But everyone knows how to run the church.
Yeah, and it's all based on things that they will not always admit.
Yeah.
Like, well, this is actually, you like that music because that's what you grew up with.
Right.
And you probably were at camp or at some conference.
Nostalgia. Yeah.
It's nostalgia.
Totally.
100%. And I'll say to people, we're actually not singing the songs that I grew up with right now either.
Right.
And we all have to submit to each other and to the Lord.
Right.
That's what this is about. So I know that you like that. I know that you like, but there are things that I like too that we don't do anymore.
And just to be fair, on the flip side, telling a young person, yeah, we do the hymns because that's part of our tradition, and that we're not going to do a new song every week that you happen to hear on the radio and you like.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not just like old people complaining about new stuff. It goes
both ways. And it drives me just as crazy when young people go to a church where there's all young people.
Right.
And they're getting what they want. And I think, to me, that's not the church.
Yeah.
The church is a intergenerational community of people who are diverse and different from one another, which requires them to submit to one another.
Yeah.
Which is what Paul, the Apostle Paul, is so passionate about in the New Testament. There's no Jew or Greek, slave or free. The wall of separation has been torn down.
Yeah.
You were once strangers, but you've been brought near.
Mm-hmm.
So how in the world could you treat people like strangers?
Right. Yeah.
This is, and then the revelation where, every tribe, nation, tongue is gathered around the throne.
Yeah.
When we could look forward to that day, but what are we doing now to prepare ourselves and our hearts for what God wants to see happen in the world today? And if the church is stuck in the same divisions as our world, which is what's happening with the church, is that they're becoming monolithic. Mm. Everybody's going to a church to hear what they want to hear.
1,000%, yeah.
Well, then where is the church, that place of community where we find common ground around our differences? Right. Because Christ is first.
Yeah.
As opposed to a secondary or tertiary thing.
Yeah.
We make that the most important thing.
Totally.
And now I want to go where that's already been decided.
It's become like everything else. It's become the same thing as you coming home and turning on the news channel that you want to.
Yeah.
It's become the same thing as you're addicted to social media because social media algorithms just keep pumping you the same stuff that you want to hear. Mm-hmm. It's total echo chamber, confirmation bias, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate the way Dave leads our church. I don't even think people know that when I stand up and look out, I go, oh, those two people should not go to the same church.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like we're doing something above politics.
Mm-hmm.
If those two people are sitting next to each other,
Yeah.
a quick conversation and they would hate each other. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
Right. And I don't think it's any different than the first century, where Paul is talking to the Corinthians and saying, look, you guys are amazingly gifted, but without love, it means nothing.
yeah.
And you have so many divisions and ways that you could look at this,
Yeah.
from comparing and complaining about spiritual gifts to the gods and goddesses in Corinth that would be literal idols to them. You used to follow mute idols, to the ways of the world and the power structures of Rome, and whether you are an officer or a slave. How is it that we're going to come together in Christ around a table
Totally.
of people that we know each other?
Yeah.
And I think that table then actually is the witness.
Yeah.
I just get chills saying
Yeah.
that. I think that is the witness.
Yeah.
I don't think the witness is, this is what my pastor says about something, or this is the position that I have on this. The witness to Christ is that people with differences come together around a table, they learn from one another, and they become empathetic, compassionate, kind, keep no record of wrongs, don't delight in evil but rejoice in the truth, always trust, always hope, always perseveres. Like that witness of love to a world, because that's what we're all longing for.
Right.
And I was just at a gathering of pastors yesterday where we did the simple exercise of asking each other 3 questions around the table, and everybody had to answer it. What do you wish people knew about you? What do you wish people understood about you? And what do you wish people could feel about you?
Yeah.
And boy, within 30 minutes, we were at this place of people talking about their insecurities. I'm 75 years old and I'm not sure I'm really useful anymore. To I'm a single woman and in a world with married couples, and I'm not sure where I fit in, and I'm an African American, and we're like, wow, we're getting somewhere here.
Yeah.
And I don't just see you as my enemy. I don't see you as different. We actually are more alike because you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
So I think that's the witness of the church that the church needs to know that they're a part of, and that the community sees with authenticity, wow, these guys aren't perfect, but they're working it out.
Right.
And the modern church that looks to smoke and mirrors, and wow, that's awesome, dark room, it's clear that we are just looking like we're facing forward instead of in circles. And there has to be some place in the church where you're in circles.
Yeah.
Has to be.
Yeah.
Around some kind of a table.
One of my favorite things in the Bible is when the Gospels are telling a story about Jesus, and when we read it, there's just like casually some names of people that were there at the beginning of the story. And usually like you skip them because you can't pronounce them anyway. You know what I mean? But then there are times that you do a deep dive into those people, and it'll be like a known prostitute and the wife of a really important Roman guard or something, you know? And I think they were writing it down with more excitement than what we read it with. Like, this person and this person were both there to hear Jesus.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, they put aside who they were, their differences, and just the fact that, like, they wrote down women's names in that time in general was a big deal. But like the fact that this person and this person came together to hear Jesus, that it was incredible. And we should be doing something bigger, more important, higher than the differences that we can experience.
Yeah. So you think of a story like Jairus, the synagogue leader, and the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, and she's crawling around trying to get to Jesus just to touch the hem of his garment, and Jairus is frantically trying to get Jesus to go back to his home to heal his daughter. And in that story, Jesus calls them both daughter. Yeah. And of course, the daughter of the leader should be important, but he stops and he listens to everything this woman who was an outcast, who whatever, hear her whole story. 12 years
Right.
of bleeding, of illness. You waited to listen to that story of 12 years while Jairus is looking at his watch going, my daughter's dying.
Yeah.
Like that's a great equalizer. And Jesus says, daughter.
Yeah.
So where do we get into those places where we see that?
And he did it to the extreme point, where they killed him. Right? To the point where he angered people so much that they killed him. Mm-hmm. And then a couple weeks ago, I saw on my social media feeds that there was an iHeart Music Worship Awards, like the Grammys, but for worship music. And they gave out best worship song of the year, and a guy got up there and accepted a trophy. And that's what we're projecting to the world that Christianity is.
It's about getting trophies.
When it's the story of a guy who brought people together radically to the point of angering them to where he was killed. Mm-hmm. The disconnect between what people think Christianity is and what it is supposed to be, I think, is growing. Mm-hmm. Especially, maybe not especially in America. Maybe especially in America. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. In this Reveal study that we did, their research of pastors who are leading churches that show some spiritual vitality, that people are actually growing, they came up with 3 qualities that I thought were worth remembering. One was that the leader is disarmingly humble. So that sorts out a whole bunch of us.
Totally.
Disarmingly humble.
Yeah. They
model a surrendered heart to God. Mm-hmm. It's not my will, but your will be done.
Yeah.
And that they experience an intimacy with God. They have their own relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And they have a passion for seeing intimacy in other people's lives.
Yeah.
That's really what they want, is for people to grow. If you don't have that, so I thought that's a really great combination. As leaders in the church, in order for us to lead people into an authentic experience with God and with each other, we need to be disarmingly humble, moderate, surrendered heart, have our own relationship with God that's intimate, and have a passion for other people growing that same intimacy. But if our passion is to just gather more people, or to raise more money,
right,
or to whatever, get the word out on social media, then you sort of get what you are looking for.
But we just had our district assembly. It's all the churches from Pismo down to Los Angeles, and they hand you a binder. You flip through, and what is it? It's your attendance numbers and your giving numbers. Mm-hmm. And did you pay your budgets to the church? Mm-hmm. And if you've paid your budgets to the greater church for 5 years, they give you a little trophy. Mm-hmm. What?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but are people becoming more
stories about how people
are people becoming more like Jesus?
Yeah,
and how do people become more like Jesus? And the way of the cross is really the only way. It has to involve suffering and coming alongside, companioning with each other through our grief. It has to. Paul talks about if we're buried with Christ, we'll be raised with Christ.
Right.
Nobody wants to be buried. Who's dying to themselves?
Right.
So, what are those experiences where people are actually growing?
Right. Big word in my generation right now is deconstruction. Mm-hmm. I did a post about this the other day. I feel like the word has now been weaponized against us, as tends to happen with these words. At some point, woke just meant we're just waking up to the injustices around the world. We've been sleeping on some stuff. Let's wake up to it. And then another side gets in, goes, you're just woke. And it becomes this negative word. Deconstruction has become a highly negative word, but I don't know what else to call it. Whatever you want to call it. Just in general, I call it the realization that in 1994, my 24-year-old youth pastors probably didn't teach me everything perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a knock on them. They just probably didn't in my years of like really understanding who God was. What has been your experience with young people questioning, doubting, all that stuff as a pastor? How do you look at that? What has been your take on that?
Yeah, I don't use the word deconstruction very much, but I do try to break things down to what does it actually mean to believe.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll tell you a story. A guy in my church who I really appreciate. He considers himself a Unitarian.
Mm-hmm.
He came to our church because he married his wife, who is a member of our church, and when we were in premarital together, I said, "Well, what's it like for you to? What does it look like for you to worship with your wife?"
Yeah.
He goes, "I love it. I love coming."
Mm.
I go, "Okay, great." So he came in recently to talk and brought in a book that somebody had given him, The Case for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I don't really understand this very much. He gave it to me as a gift. And he had asked me the question of why does an all-powerful God need to be worshipped? All-sufficient God need to be worshipped?
Sure.
And so I said, well, I think we need to worship God more than God needs to be worshipped.
Mm-hmm.
If we put him first, then other things fall in place. And I'm talking to somebody who doesn't fully believe in Jesus and doesn't really fully believe in the Holy Spirit, a Unitarian, right?
Yeah.
So I said, well, what is your experience of worship? He goes, oh, I love worship. I love worship. Well, what do you love about it? He goes, I just feel hope. I go, why? He says, because, you actually give us something to think about, but you give us a hope, like we can actually do something here that God, like, oh. So you see God as like the giver of good gifts, and God has blessed you with your marriage, and so you feel somehow God is involved in your life. Yeah. And what else? Well, you talk so personally and so practically about following Jesus and the way of Jesus, and like, okay, that's good. And you like that. You want to be more like that. Yeah. And then what else? He goes, I don't know. I just feel like this energy around me. I'm maybe let's just say that's the Holy Spirit. So if I could reframe your understanding of what you are, you're actually a believer in a God who gives good gifts and oversees this thing. Jesus, who actually shows us the way to live, and it seems like the right way to go. And then the Holy Spirit, who seems to surround us in worship.
Right.
It sounds like you're a Trinitarian. I mean, I want to say about him, to believe is not just to think things in your head. It's actually to live differently. Mm-hmm. And you are living differently in this reality of this Trinitarian reality. So to me, that's a bit of a deconstruction. It says, well, what does it actually mean to believe?
Yeah.
What it means to believe is to live as if what I know is true.
Right. Like
I'm sitting in this chair, believing it'll hold me up. Mm-hmm. If I didn't, I wouldn't be sitting in it. So right. I'm trusting this chair.
Yeah.
So I said, you actually are more committed as a follower of Jesus than members of our church who come like once a month. You're here every week. And I see your joy, and I see you've changed. And it's hard for him to get over the intellectual hump of what it means to believe. To a lot of people it means to figure everything out to the nth degree, so there is no doubt any longer.
Right.
And I just don't think that's faith. And I think that when we get to heaven, and you wonder about what does judgment look like, and do we make it in? I just think there are people who are incapable of understanding or embracing everything that we say you're supposed to believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Why do I believe that Kelly is going to be safe in her Heavenly Father's arms?
Yeah. Kelly, my sister.
Your sister.
Cerebral palsy.
There are things that she will never intellectually be able to say yes to.
Totally.
And he's going to say, you know what? You knew me.
Okay.
And I knew you.
I agree.
Yeah.
So let's just say that's a disclaimer, right? Okay, heaven and hell, but disclaimer, Kelly has cerebral palsy. She can't understand it all. In the rabbit hole that I go down is I can't imagine how any of us doesn't have a disclaimer.
Well, that's what my point was. The person I was talking to has their own intellectual disability.
Yes.
In that they're so smart.
Yes.
They can't get to a place of fully surrendering because it feels like intellectually dishonest for them.
Right.
And I'm going to say, I don't know that I can sign a document to say this is what I believe, but I just have to think in God's gracious mercy, he would say, I know you could never really get over that.
Yeah.
Because I know there's things in my life, whether by choice or not, I am who I am. And there's things that I've had to struggle with to actually trust God.
Yeah.
To be God.
Yeah.
So I think that's deconstructing a little bit. What does it actually mean to believe?
Right.
And believe is more behavior than it is intellectual assent. Because I don't fully understand the resurrection. I believe it, and I want to live as if it's true, which means, hey, there's new life for me.
Yeah.
Today and into eternity. And I'm going to live as if that's true.
Yeah.
But I don't fully understand the resurrection.
I understand it as a metaphor of someone sacrificing for me. Do not understand it on a spiritual, supernatural,
or even on a physics level.
Yeah, yeah. Like why it had to happen makes no sense to me. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense to me. Mm-hmm. Like every Easter, when we celebrate Easter, and we go, he won victory over sin. This victory. Mm-hmm. Was he going to lose? Like, was there... Like, it's only victory if there was a chance of losing? Could he have lost? You know what I mean? Like, those are the... Pretty much everything that is practical about Christianity, it's, like, obvious for me to sign off on because I've been living it for long enough to know that when I'm daily attached to it, when the yoke is on and it's guiding me in the right direction, my life is just better, produces more fruit. Not everything goes well. It's not a magical thing, but my life is better. Everything on a supernatural level, prayer, miracles, makes no sense to me. I can't comprehend it. I don't think I'll ever fully know what it is, but I feel a pressure from Christianity in general that really they're not looking for faith, they're looking for certainty. And I'm never going to get there. And working here at this church with a pastor that like embraces that in me, I don't know that how many churches in America I could work in and do this podcast and ask questions, or do my radio show I do with Dave and pepper him with questions, or have the openness to say, I have no idea how prayer works. It doesn't make any sense to me. And really my prayer life has just become a gratitude list because I don't want it to be the wrong thing. You know what I mean? And so I feel like I have more faith because if faith is like believing in the face without being able to see, I feel like people with doubts have more faith to keep coming back Sunday after Sunday than the person who like has no doubts and believes and all those things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's hard to be in a Christian community and not get stuck in a way of life that looks like it's Christian, but it doesn't stretch me in the ways that actually are required of me as a Christian.
Yeah.
So, for example, one of the themes in my life, in our family, is the theme of loss and grief. Which is a common experience for most of the world.
Yeah. And
in the Christian community, if there's no room for tears and anger and disappointment, and we can't really journey with somebody through their grief, then that person will learn that grief is not important. And that God doesn't actually meet us in our grief. He meets us in our joy. And we miss out on the opportunity of actually tapping into our own experience of grief enough to know I actually have some hope to offer this person.
Yeah.
Not by answering all their questions or fixing it all, but just simply being present with them.
Right.
And if my faith doesn't allow me to sit with people who have questions, then I'm not sure that I'm really all that mature in my faith.
Yeah.
So that because faith is entering into the unknown with the certainty that God is present with me.
Right.
And we can define our Christian lives as God would never ask me to do that. God wouldn't ask me to give up something that's really important to me.
Yeah.
Whether it's half hour of time or it's moving someplace or, but sometimes the greatest joy is being with people who are just struggling, and it requires us to tap into a deeper level of, well, what have I actually experienced in my life of healing that would be of benefit to somebody else?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I wish more Christians and more pastors just would say, I don't know, and it's not okay. You know what I mean?
mm-hmm.
Instead of the things I grew up with of, well, God must have needed another angel in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Like trying to
Mm-hmm.
justify stuff happening instead of just going, yeah, I don't know. It's not okay.
Yeah.
You know?
It's hard. Yeah, I don't know. I'm so sorry. I don't know. The Amy and I decided coming out of COVID that we would lead a grief group at our church.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never done it before.
Yeah.
And surprisingly, growing up where I lost my younger brother when I was 9.
Yeah.
Christopher was 3.5.
Yeah.
And Pat was 11 and Kirk was 5. Younger brother, older brother, your dad. And, at that time, we didn't know how to grieve.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I experienced the church was just moving on.
Yeah.
And not.
When you say you didn't know, like, what does that mean? Like culture didn't know how to grieve. Your family didn't know how to grieve. Like,
yeah. You know what? C.S. Lewis has a great quote that goes something like, "I sat with my anger long enough to know that her real name was grief."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would say that for most of my life, anger has been my issue to deal with. And anger management is one thing, but anger as an expression of grief is another.
Mm-hmm.
And anger can be turned inward, become depression. It can be projected on other people inappropriately. Anger can motivate us to do other things, but anger really as a primary expression of emotion over and over and over again only hurts you.
Yeah.
And hurts others. And so I took this grief course. We were leading this grief course, and Amy and I it's this beautiful book. It's called Understanding Your Grief. Mm-hmm. And the primary idea is that you can't fix someone else's grief. You can't treat their grief. All you can do is companion with them through their grief.
Yeah. Which
means I'm willing to walk with you through your grief and see what you discover. Yeah. And help you understand that, others have grieved too. And there's no timeline, there's no process, there's no whatever. It's just a matter of journeying together and somebody with you while you're grieving to know that you're not alone in your grief and you're not crazy in your grief. So I identified my own, everybody, all the participants are supposed to identify the person they're grieving. And so I identified Christopher and my dad who died 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And I learned a ton.
Yeah.
And it was fun as a pastor to take the course lead while I was also journaling my own things. And so I think that really helped me understand my anger that was not well understood when I was a kid. Because an angry kid, there's other words you use besides, oh, he's just grieving.
Yeah.
He's rebellious. He's acting out.
Totally. Yeah. It's a phase. It's just, no, this is what kids do.
Yeah, kids, teenagers. Yeah. And it had been brought to my attention over the years. My anger maybe was an issue I needed to deal with, but never really connected it to my grief. I'm going to deal with my anger by not being so angry or try to control my anger.
Right.
And I had to go to a deeper place of embracing what I lost. And then I could let go.
Yeah.
I could let go of that anger. And now I feel like coming into retirement, it feels like I'm in a different place.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you just one other part about that is that one of the things that was hard for us as a family growing up was being able to talk about difficult things.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of things going on, but nobody ever talked about it.
Yeah. Do you think like when you were 9, that era was just very much like we have to paint a picture of a perfect family that's doing well? I think of did you ever watch Marvelous Miss Maisel, that show? Like one of the very first episodes, there's a scene, they're newlyweds, and she waits for him to go to sleep, and then she goes and takes her makeup off, and then they sleep, and she wakes up before he does, and she goes and puts her makeup on and wakes up, so it looks like she's just perfect all the time. That's kind of what it reminds me of. Is that fair to say that that grief, that pain had more of a stigma then that it does now? That people are more open to therapy, to just the idea that everyone's not okay on some level.
Yeah.
Right. They're quicker to jump into a grief group, a therapy, as compared to when you were 9.
I think it's also hard that when the adults in your life are also all grieving.
Yeah.
Then it's hard for people to think, oh, how do we help you there? Also, I think it was true then and it's true now. We have this false idea that kids are resilient. And I don't think kids are actually resilient. I think they just don't know how to express themselves in adult ways. Yeah. And so when we see them doing well at school, or they're doing well in sports, or they have friends, they're happy, then you think, well, they must be over it. And then we don't talk about it. But we don't even do simple things like, hey, so Brendan asked me on Father's Day, hey, what memories do you have of your dad, of Grandpa Jack? What memories do you have of him?
Yeah.
Like a good memory. What was a good memory?
Right.
And, it's like, those are good questions to ask people who have lost someone.
Yeah.
Hey, so do you ever think about so-and-so?
Yeah.
And sometimes people, most often they'll say, I think about him all the time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And is that weird that I think about him all the time? I said, no.
Yeah.
Do you have happy thoughts, sad thoughts? Both. I cry. Like, wow. Thanks for sharing that. They don't know.
Yeah.
Like this is when people, I look out in the congregation and people that I know have just lost a loved one. Let's say they're even, whatever, they lost their spouse they were married to for 30 or 40 years, and they come back to church, and I'm so aware that they are living in their own little world and nobody understands what they're going through. And I think they are beginning to introduce themselves to others without their spouse next to them.
Yeah.
What does that feel like?
Yeah.
And what courage it takes to actually show up. And I want to make sure I go up to them and say, hey, how are you? You made it.
Right.
Way to go. Well, yeah, I sat here and I cried the whole time. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I know it probably doesn't seem like you have much faith. No, you had faith to show up here.
Yeah.
And what your tears tell me a lot about, like God is doing something in you.
Yeah.
Like this is important. She goes, I'm just so glad that you know that. Right. So I think I don't know what that is, but I think that things change generationally, but we have the same excuses today as we had 50 years ago. Same excuses. It's always something that is external to us that is somehow an indication that we're okay.
Totally. Social media. I'm okay. Hey, thumbs up. Yep. Thumbs up. Here's my highlight reel of the vacation we just went on. It was a total disaster and my kids hate me, but here's a photo of us at Disneyland.
And it sanitizes the whole thing, because the best part of a vacation are the things that don't go well.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
The thing you didn't expect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those stories don't get told because, it's awesome.
Yeah, that's true. We've talked a lot about negative things about the church. What are you excited about? About the church? About you could take this any direction. What you're going to be doing,
Mm-hmm.
where do you see God doing cool things? What are you excited about moving forward?
Mm-hmm. I think somebody yesterday, I was talking to them saying there's this idea that the church goes through a rummage sale every 500 years, and it takes about 100 years to get rid of all of the stuff. And I think we are going through a dramatic change in the church. In the last 25 years, it's been well documented and researched that the church began a decline 25 years ago. And I remember 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the inability of the people at the time to say, change is coming, we need to do something.
Yeah.
They kept thinking, how do we go back to what we were doing before?
Right.
We must be doing something wrong.
Right.
This is 40 years ago conversations.
Yeah.
And I think that when we see the real numbers, it's causing us to take another look at the church. I don't believe the church is dead. I think the church is having to reform itself. There are new worshiping communities that are popping up everywhere. There are existing churches that are in decline and dying. There's other churches that have adjusted. I'm really happy where we are as a church right now. I've never seen more unity or gratitude. At once, just as a picture, at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, we have people meeting inside the church, out on the patio. That's all in English. And right across the patio, we have a Spanish-speaking worship service that are members of our church that are meeting at the same time. We all come out and have coffee and donuts together. That seems really simple. And over the time that I've been there, they haven't always been at the same patio. They've been other places.
Yeah.
But I think that says something really important about the church. We're in a time where we need to figure out how we are one.
Yeah.
And begin to break down those barriers.
What
are you saying?
I don't know if it's possible. Doesn't feel possible.
To be one.
Yeah.
Well, at least in our community.
What
we're called to do right now is that we are becoming brothers and sisters. We're trying to do this.
Sure.
And that ministry with those people led our church 11 years ago into a journey of immigration and providing immigration services in our community.
Yeah.
And 200 people have become citizens in the last 7 years.
Yeah.
That's not nothing. That's
totally.
That's pretty neat. And we tutor 250 kids. So in this time where we can't figure out, well, how in the world do we break through these barriers? I don't know. We can't change the system of the whole world. But if we look at our own church and what's the calling of the church, to lean into relationships in our community, to love our neighbors, to bless our neighbors, to bless our children, to surrender our lives, submit to one another.
Totally.
we can do some things. And whether that's 1,000 people worshiping now or 400 people or 200 people, how do we take the people that we are right now? How do we take this group of people and trust God with faithful steps toward doing something that builds up the church and demonstrates something unique?
Yeah.
So I'm enthusiastic about that. In the short term, all these divisions drive me crazy.
Yeah.
So
I think I am cynical, so I tend to have less hope for the church moving forward. But I do think the only chance that we have of surviving is putting emphasis back in the local church. Because this idea of like Hillsong New York and Hillsong LA is ridiculous. And we've allowed certain people and certain churches to create power structures that are going to eventually harbor bad things and crumble, right? And it's already started to happen. And I think collectively as Christians, we've completely lost the right to speak into culture as a collective group. But individually, your local church can earn the right to speak into your community.
that's totally right.
You can serve your community in a way that maybe no one else in the world will care, but your community can care about what you're saying because and if enough local churches did that across America, we'd have a way better shot than putting all our faith in one guy who's a really good speaker who has millions of dollars to pump into social media and all that stuff, who will eventually fail because we all fail at some level. And then we completely lose the right to speak into culture. Does that make sense? Like
Yep.
the only chance I think we have is for everyone to stop trying to make money off this thing, to stop trying to have 1 million followers and focus on literally one community that they can serve in.
What does it mean to be the church? Not to go to church, but to be the church. And so I think all of those things, it is about the whole thing's about discipleship. It's about what kind of disciples are being created who love God and love others, who actually care about life beyond the walls of their church, to say, in what simple ways is God calling us to invest time, gifts, resources into blessing our community. It all, so, and all the big things, like the big things that we do as a church right now, all started really small. Like it was one of our Hispanic pastors who went into the community, because in Solana Beach, it used to be, before it was an incorporated city, there was Solana Beach and Eden Gardens, and Eden Gardens was a historically immigrant community. Now it's all Solana Beach. They went to different schools. They went to Spanish-speaking schools. There was all integrated, and Hispanic pastor came and started gathering kids together and tutoring a few kids around his kitchen table. And about 5 years later, that became a nonprofit, and now it tutors 250 kids. But it started with somebody going into the neighborhood and saying, what are the needs of our neighbors? And let's go do that. Let's go do that.
If your sanctuary and all your buildings are only being used on Sunday, you're not doing it right.
What else can we do? What can we do? So I'm really proud of the fact that we've done things over the years that help us get to know our neighbors or see the needs of the community. Once a year, we cancel church on a Sunday. As sort of symbolic that...
You know how many times I've pitched that here? I've pitched that idea so many times because I love that you guys do that.
Well, so once a year, and we do somewhere between 50 to 80 projects around the county.
Super.
And it's symbolic in that we're saying, worshiping in the sanctuary is not the only way for us to worship God. And if we do a work day on a Saturday, the same people will show up. And I want everybody to show up, and I want there to be something for preschoolers and seniors. If the seniors want to write encouragement notes or do a knitting group, and the preschoolers want to pot plants and take them to shut-ins, it's got to be good for everybody. And it forces us to always be thinking outward into our community. Who are our neighbors that we're called to love? I think those are good practices. And, where are there opportunities? So, I don't know. That seems like, I think the church, I think when we read the New Testament, and you look at the churches that Paul is writing to, when he writes the book of Romans, probably 5 house churches that are filled with people of different socioeconomic levels, military people, slaves, rich, poor, Jew, Gentile, different languages. He actually believes that they are going to become something, which to me is remarkable. And the person who's delivering the message to those churches probably has memorized the book of Romans, the letter to the Romans, probably helped Paul write it with his friends who are writing it down and things, and was a woman. And she's delivering this message to this group of people, which kind of looks like the ragtag group of the disciples as well, that actually would become something. That's remarkable to me. And I think he was calling them to be the church. And there is something to be said about the size of our churches that keep us from being the church. And the larger we are, the fewer people we know. So during COVID, and after we began regathering, we moved to 1 service time instead of 2. We thought, well, if we did 2 services, that would be successful, because that's what we used to do.
Totally.
And we said, no, let's do 1 service. And it was because one of the Sundays we were regathered and we were celebrating somebody's retirement. we were going to get ready. We were getting ready to do 2 services on a Sunday, 2 hours, like 8:30 and 10:30.
Yeah.
We thought, well, if we do that, then we have to do 2 parties for the retirement thing. Let's just postpone it, and let's postpone the 2 service thing and just do 1 service, and then everybody can have lunch together. And I remember walking out on the patio and seeing people sitting around long tables for this party, and I saw people's desire to know each other and to be connected to one another. And I started hearing conversations from people sitting across the table who have both been in our church for 35 years and didn't know each other.
Right. Totally.
I thought, well, how is it that you all have come to congregational meetings and voted on anything without knowing each other?
Yeah, totally.
How is it that you guys have felt good about this church or wanted the church to be something without actually knowing each other? How is it that we have been something? And so I thought, this right here of community is better than separating people out. So let's do our outdoor service along with the 19-foot wide LED screen outside, and we'll do the inside service. We have plenty of room. We could double our size and still not need 2 services.
Yeah.
And then once every 6 weeks, we have a free lunch, and people enjoy it, and there's something for the kids to do. And like that unity comes from knowing each other.
Right.
And that gratitude comes from knowing each other. And that, to me, gives me hope that in my retirement, whoever the next person is, there's a spiritual vitality and a depth to our life together that really ought to withstand a healthy transition.
Yeah.
And in this time, I started to say earlier, I didn't grow up in our church, in our home, knowing how to put a difficult thing on the table and sit with that.
Yeah.
And for us to put our retirement on the table and people to be shocked, and that's okay. You guys are shocked, disappointed, sad. Oh, you're also happy for us? Oh, that's great. And the process seems really good. And now we can keep talking about that hard thing on the table and figuring out, oh, do we need to adjust something else? What else needs to be done before we leave? It feels really healthy as a church to go through this change together.
Yeah.
And people can't just leave because they don't like change. We're all learning how to do this together. And it feels like it's an accumulation of my own growth in trust in God.
Yeah.
To take 1 step at a time without worrying about what the 10th step is.
Yeah.
And that's what it means to trust each other and to trust God. And that feels like a really healthy place to be.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this. This was fun. I was looking forward to this all week.
Yeah,
I appreciate you coming by, man.
Mm-hmm.
If retirement ends up with you tinkering around in the garage, that's okay also. But I know that you're probably still going to do some cool things moving forward.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, thanks, Eric.